welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and tonight I'm joined by my other host.
It's Magic, also known as May.
And we're continuing our series on CubeCon 2023. What we're going to talk about on this particular episode, the last one we did, was kind of the overview of all the wonderful experiences that May and myself had. But during this episode, we're going to talk about the things that we learned for each one of our featured cubes. In this case, UberBear's Artifact Cube, UberBear's Horror Cube, and May's Fey Cube. And before we go any further down this conversation, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. May, would you mind opening us up with what you're having?
I am having another Wilson's Orchard, but this time I'm having Honey Crisp.
And I am having another one of those wonderful beer selections that were gifted to me by Dan Lupe, Barely Lupe. And it was we did this Wisconsin versus North Carolina Raleigh swap type thing where we communicated before we went to CubeCon. And I was super excited because I brought a 6-pack and Dan brought a 6-pack. And during this particular episode, I'm about to crack open and I'm really excited. Mud Puppy Porter, which sounds fun. Also made in Wisconsin. So I'm pretty hype about that. Thank you, Dan, for providing the libations for this particular show. Let's go ahead and crack them open. Let's get to the topic. Oh, wow. That's delicious. Thank you, Dan. All right, May, which cube of yours was featured at this particular con?
Oh, geez, what a mystery. It's the Fey Cube. We've been talking about it for the last several episodes. But, in case you didn't know, the Fey Cube was featured there, and it went very well. A lot of people really enjoyed it, except for you, apparently.
Yes, I know. I enjoyed it. I got to go into the grand finale, the crescendo versus Justin Parnell, where I was defeated. I died a warrior's death. Thank you, Justin. But I did, as I mentioned on a previous episode, I got to boomerang one of his tap lands on the play. So I'm excited to do that. But other than that, I paid for that. I just got greedy. It was just it's a beef. It's a love thing that I've got going where I'm just seeking this win from Justin Parnell. And I imagine a lot of people, as I went around the room and I asked, like, have you ever beat Justin? They're like, no. I'm like, oh yeah, me too. Me too. So Justin, coming for you when you come hanging out with us in Raleigh. But yeah, that was, I had a wonderful time in your cube. You want to tell us a little bit about your experiences, May?
Absolutely. So, now obviously when we're there, we're not there to draft our own cube. We can draft our own cubes whenever we want. But what we're there for is the experience from everybody else. And I got a lot of comments and people talking to me about their experience and how much fun they had and the things that they enjoyed drafting. And that was really pleasant. But there were a good number of highlights that people kind of felt on the fence about. That was pretty interesting. But as is with any criticism that you get from anybody, that it's a matter of taking it with a grain of salt and figuring out whether or not that is a necessary change or not. I have a small list of things. I know how badly you're itching to talk to me about the funny book.
Oh, yes. The folio of what?
Folio of Fancies.
Oh, yeah. So
it is a 1 blue artifact. You can play XX and tap it, and each player draws a card. But that's not the good part. You can also pay 2 and a blue to tap it, and each opponent mills cards equal to the amount of cards in their hand. So,
here we go. So I pack one, pick one. I'm super hyped. I talked about this in the previous episode. And I crack me the greatest Magic card of all time. Shivan Dragon. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm building this. So as my draft began to develop, because that was my day one, draft one, was the Fey Cube, because I was just having some coffee at this point, and I thought it was a great cube to just kind of start the morning out with. Pack one, pick one, Shivan. And then as it progressed, I wanted to talk to you about a secondary thing. In a previous episode, we had pointed out, what's the laboratory?
Riptide Laboratory.
We had pointed out the 1 fish, 2 fish art on Riptide Laboratory and how when we were doing kind of a on our way to CubeCon series, we talked about during our WoW episode, the additions that May was making to this environment prior to CubeCon. One of the cards that I'd actually flagged as I felt was a problematic card was Riptide Laboratory. So obviously when it gets passed to me, I snagged it up as fast as possible. So while my top end was Shivan Dragon, because I built this kind of Grixis hodgepodge of wizards, and I thought I could really break it with stuff like, I guess, like Archaeomancer, etc. I was going to do some shenanigans. I wanted to go ahead and redact my statement on that particular card and say that it did not play as hateful as I thought it would because the environment, as May had stated previously, was tempoed slower. But because I was really leaning in onto this slow, abuse the Riptide Laboratory type of strategy and top ending out with Shivan Dragon, I got Una also, and I was really wanting to kind of just hold the battlefield down with some bounce effects, some wizards, kind of try to abuse that Riptide Laboratory. It really made me susceptible to some aggro hate type strategies because I was really going for the large, the grand finale of the Shivan Dragon and the Una burning you to death type situation, milling you out, which did happen a few times, right? But in my very first match, Folio Fantasies dropped down by turn 2, and I was ill-equipped to be able to deal with this card. At the time, I didn't have the boomerangs and whatnot in my hand. And my opponent says, how many cards in hand? And I'm like, 7? He's like, all right, tap, mill 7. I was like,
Yep.
And I watched all my major game pieces, all my strategy just getting flushed away into the graveyard. And then we kind of rotated around that. And this card cut me to pieces because I saw, because I had no reanimation, no reclaim effects, not really. And so I did have a bit of a beef, a little pre-gaming that I had with May about this card. And I even mentioned it while we were at CubeCon. May, I got decimated by this card. Are you sticking to your guns on it?
I'm sticking to my guns. It's staying. I think it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine, May. It's fine.
It's fine. I drafted Folio Fancies, and then I made a kind of Is It Clock deck, where my whole shtick was that I was just going to focus on a lot of draw, control cards, whatever, and then grab Folio Fancies or the Improbable Alliance in order to just create clocks and run my opponent over. And the reality is that it's just fine. It's a fine card. If it sticks, then it can be a problem, but by the time that it gets to be a problem, everybody else is already getting set up and getting a board presence. It doesn't actually help you deal with the board or deal damage. It just gets rid of their library.
So the comedy of errors is after I come out of the match, I'm talking to my good friend Christian, and I'm like, I got just cut to ribbons by this card. And he's like, oh yeah, really? I didn't. My opponent, I believe it was the same opponent, he's like, he just drew cards with it. I'm like, what? I was like, So yeah. It's a great card. I can see it. It was more of a focus on the Riptide Laboratory because we had talked about that during a previous episode, how I felt that card was entirely too powerful for the environment. And I did not see that to be the case because the speed of the environment did not allow me to do the breakage that I was attempting to do. So that was me trying to do like a very technical deck. And because I set myself up with such that high mana value rate of Una and Shivan Dragon, etc., that it was really easy for that low to the ground, early turns, Folio Fantasies to come in and start cutting me to pieces. I was a little underwhelmed with my original reaction that I thought the Riptide would do, but now I totally feel bad because in full disclosure, I passed the Fantasies over and over again. So I got what was coming to me as a drafter, I suppose, because I knew the power of this card, May, but I just decided I wasn't going to really go down the route. And then later in the draft, I got Una and felt a little, I'm like, oh man, dang, I've already passed this, right? But I just used Una as a top level threat. It actually won me quite a few matches. That one I did enjoy.
Oh, Una's great on her own.
Oh yeah, the card's disgusting. I did get some mill outs with it. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of that card now in the environment. What was really cool about what I saw is all the synergies that you had envisioned came to life during my draft. And I saw a lot of players do the thing, right? And one particular thing that I told you about was somebody pulled off the party mechanic. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes.
And what was I watched it live and I got beat to death by it. And I'm telling you, it was glorious. And I'm telling you that this player in particular was a D&D player and was so hype about pulling off this particular deck building strategy that they took pictures, sent it to their friends. Hey, can I pause? I'm like, absolutely. I'm already dying to you anyways. I'm going to send these pictures to my friend group. And it was fantastic. What's the driving card for that in your environment?
So Nalia de Arnais is a 1 white black human rogue. You may look at the top card of your library. You may cast cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard spells from the top of your library. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain death touch until end of turn, and she's a 3/3 creature. So starting right off the gate of a 3/3 creature that lets you look at and cast the top card of your library is already really strong in this environment. But the way that the Orzhov party deck curved out so powerfully in this environment that it ended up getting really popular in this environment. I don't know if it's problematic, but that is one of the few things that I'm going to be looking at. Nolly is definitely going to be staying. I got a lot of comments, a lot of people talking about how that was their favorite thing of getting the party together and getting to do the party thing. Because even during Zendikar's Rising set, a lot of the party decks just didn't come together like this. So I'm really happy to have an environment that party gets to do the party thing. But the part that made Nalia very difficult to get around is that turn 1, turn 2, you play anything that's not a rogue. And then on turn 3, you play Nalia. And then on turn 4, you can play things like a regular cohort, which is just a 2/2 for 4 that brings in another changeling 2/2. And the problem was, by turn 4, you would have a full party already ready to activate Nalia. And that was really spooky for a lot of decks. So what I'm thinking about doing is I'm going to take out a regular cohort, which will also just take out an additional token anyways. But I'm also going to look at some of the other, not changeling packages specifically just because changelings overlap with everything, but specifically I'm going to be looking at those core cards in the Orzhov party deck and try to make sure that it's a little slower, just slowing it down a smidge, so that way other decks get a chance to shine. But I am so happy that everybody got to play the Nalia deck.
Oh, yeah. So in my matchup, like I said, I kind of did a Grixis control shell in so many words, right, with top ends. My first player did the embrace the mill, the entire mill idea and just cut me to pieces. The second one took on the party mechanic, which put me into the third and, the bottom matchup versus Justin Parnell. And Justin actually did something too that I've kind of saved to talk about with you that I thought was fantastic. Is he built a Warriors deck with Obsidian Battle Axe as the driver. Obsidian Battle Axe for 3 colorless. It is a typal artifact warrior equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+1 and has haste. Whenever a warrior comes into play, you may attach Obsidian Battle Axe to it, equipped for 3, which he never paid. Because he kept dropping warriors in, giving them haste, and turning creatures sideways. I mean, it cut me to pieces. It was such a fast deck. And the fact that he picked this up, he built a natural warriors deck with a sprinkle of changelings to fill it out, May. And it was absolutely glorious. Mm-hmm. And I was getting cut to pieces by these different faster strategies than me. But I just wanted to let you know that he complimented the fact that this card, and it was beautiful. It made the deck win over and over again. I was so impressed with this card. Was this a recent ad or something that was in there previously?
No, it's been in the cube since the get-go. And it's a card that I've adamantly defended. And I kept saying to my pod and Miscellaneous that this card is good. Y'all just need to give it a try, because the warrior package is there. It's just nobody's been playing it, so it hasn't been a part of the meta. But it makes me extremely happy to hear that a bunch of warrior decks got to do their thing, and Obsidian Battle Axe was the forefront of it, because that's a card I kept defending in this environment. It's a card that I've kept in this environment, and every time I'm just like, it equips to warriors, it equips to changelings, it gives haste. It's good.
Yeah, so sometime on Saturday, I signed up for my various cube events, and I wanted to play the Live the Dream made by David McDarby, which I've played before so bad that I kept putting it. But because of the popularity of that cube and because of the algorithm, I kind of got shoved down the list, right? And my fourth pick on all the cubes on a particular Saturday was actually Uberbear's Artifact Cube. And I'm like, well, whatever. If it happens, it happens. And it did happen. So I sat down.
Oh, no.
And I drafted my own cube. And people stared at me like, is this your cube? Why are you drafting your own cube? And I'm like, I don't know. It's just like my fourth pick. But like, here we are. We're doing this thing. And I get faced up with probably one of, in my opinion, the strongest curators and who understands my environment. And that is our good friend of the show, Dan Schneider, who has the Devoid Cube. And if there's anybody that knows anything about how to navigate artifacts, etc., it's Dan. So I'm like, all right, Dan, we were the first matchup, and let's talk about your strategy, which, by the way, decimated me. And I wanted to know, like, what was your game plan? Because he actually is an individual that studied the cube and was aware of the 2022 iteration of Uberbear's Artifact Cube, where the Selesnya package was considered the Boogie Bear or the Booga Bear because of the Sam Black matches and all the, I guess, the featured cube situation it had, where people saw that particular shell was the control shell, if you will. So he came in with a plan. And before I go any further, I've talked about on numerous Lessons Learned episodes, which I do recommend everybody check out, where I have actually nerfed that package and made it more friendly. And as the draft is going around the table, we had a bunch of people that weren't overly familiar with the cube that kind of got slotted into the drafts, and they were not high picking the Selesnya components. And me as the curator, I'm just kind of like, whatevs. So I did like a Boros equipment package, but I'm kind of inadvertently seating the players to the left and the right of me. Like I'm passing cards that you wouldn't traditionally pass because I want to see them happen. And so I'm not keeping the best deck ever. So I sit down in my first match. I'm like, oh God, it's Dan, right? And Dan knows what he's doing. And Dan cuts me down with the Selesnya package. And I wanted to ask about like, what's going on here? He designed an entire package with no artifact creatures, or at least a few. He had like, I guess, Verduris, Gear Hulk, etc. But he kept it so that his creatures were impervious to artifact hate. And he drafted 6+ pieces of hate, I think approximately 5 actually, which was like the disenchant effects. And then I noticed another thing too. One of the players at the table goes, hey, is there any spot removal for artifacts in this cube? I didn't notice any. And Dan just kind of smiles. He had scooped it all up, May. He'd taken it all. When I told you I
mean, it's better than a kill spell in this environment.
It is. And by building this entire strategy where your creatures aren't artifact driven, and to give an example, he picked up stuff like Gilded Goose and Manglehorn, and then Kappa Tech Engineer and stuff like that, right? Where he could interact but not worry about getting his creatures taken out by the opposing Manglehorns and whatnot, right? And the only time that his deck was truly challenged was in a Dimir counterspell deck. Kind of almost a replay of last year's events, except Dan, having studied the cube and aware of it, knew that these were the must-grab components, and the other drafters were kind of just like, I want to do the thing, like Goblin Welder and all kinds of nonsense. But it was really fun, so I kind of did this breakdown with Dan to like get some feedback. And here's what he had to say. He sent me an image of the deck, which I'll share in the show notes, but he said it's actually maybe not the best representation of the goal, but as many of the high-impact cards did not turn out to be artifacts. Gear Hulk, he had Hinge in there, and he had the Seraph. But they were ultimately just good cards that died to removal anyway, so I wasn't relying on any specific artifacts to inform the game plan, and I got to play 5 Shatters plus Savini's Reclamation to rebuy them. So you can see where like the Manglehorns and stuff like that of the world were cutting people to pieces. But for me as a curator, I'm okay with that outcome because he understood like the high pick deck in this environment, and the others were kind of doing wonderful decks, but they were kind of really embracing the jank, if you will, a little bit. Specifically, like I played against this one individual that was having this wonderful time with doing just straight up welder nonsense, right? And they ultimately beat me too. But it was fun to watch the different decks across the table emerge. And as a result of Dan's observations within my environment, I have yet again trimmed back one more Selesnya hate card and added one more creature removal card. Very micro changes, I guess, based on the feedback to the environment, just to make it a little better. And we'll talk about that here shortly. May, do you have anything to add to that?
I do think that your Selesnya packages are a lot better than they used to be in terms of, I want to say, people's ability to play and respond.
Yeah.
Because before, your package was really mean, where we had, what was it called? The Tabernacle wannabe.
Oh yeah. I was just doing things that
Yeah,
you couldn't get anything to stick.
Yeah, nothing would stick, and in this type of environment, it was backbreaking. But even in this case, with like things like Mangohorn, and I don't think Mangohorn should go. I think that it's perfectly fine for this environment. I am glad that this package still exists within this environment, and whatever needs to be tuned in order for this Selesnya hate package to continue to exist in a healthy manner, I think is good. I think that even though that its density is not quite where you want it to be, I am glad that it exists in a better state than it was.
Another game that I walked up on was Pleasant Kenobi. It was actually, and I'm honored, thank you, by the way, Vince. It was the first cube that he had drafted. It was the first cube of the day, and I was super excited about that, right, to have somebody like Pleasant Kenobi draft my cube. But as I walked up, he's using Crystal Shard to bounce Manglehorn over and over again. And I'm like, Vince, I can't. I love it. Yeah. Like, I don't know if I can sit here in good conscience, sit here and watch this happen. So I'm going to just kind of buzz away. He was cutting people to pieces with it. It's pretty great. But there was a particular card that as I butterflied around the room, as I do, right? Because I spent a lot of my time not drafting so much as just kind of following the trends of my cube and watching people draft. All right, there was a card that we had flagged as a team early on that did make its way into the cube that I watched dominate games. And surprisingly enough, it had nothing to do with the Selesnya hate package, if you will, right? And this was Sardardian Avenger for 1 colorless and 1 mountain. You get a creature goblin warrior 1/1. It has first strike, trample. Whenever Sardardian Avenger attacks, it gets +X, +0 until end of the turn, where X is the number of artifacts your opponents control. Let's talk about that for a second. It's incomplete from a curation standpoint. In my mind, that's in complete opposition to what Red traditionally does with stuff like Abrade effects, etc., right? For it to actually want the artifacts to exist to make this creature hit for more is an odd duck. But then on the other side of this coin, as I finish the text, is whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Sardardian Avenger deals 1 damage to that player. So it played into that Rakdos sacrifice kind of aristocrats type of artifact theme that I was trying to run. But I saw players just putting a piece of equipment on this thing and charging in and literally hating people for basically playing my cube. Ultimately, I was punishing people to play my cube. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's against the spirit of what I was trying to do. As a curator...
The fact that this card was allowed to exist in your environment anyways was kind of an abomination.
It was a mistake.
I ran it in my Agatha deck, not even related to anything that I'm doing, just because it wins games.
Yeah, and I observed this card basically all six games, all 6 matches. I walked around and I saw this card and I looked for players playing it, and every time I saw them, they were doing something really egregious with it. And all I really wanted was the unique juxtaposition of those 2 statements. One says that I'm going to get a huge payoff for not blowing up your stuff, and the other one says you're going to get punished if something goes in the yard. Now, there was a second card. There was a package. Whenever I first was picking these out, there was a second card, and it was Pain Distributor. For 2 colorless and 1 red, you get a creatures, devil, citizen, menace. Whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, they create a treasure token. Whenever an artifact an opponent controls is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, Pain Distributor deals 1 damage to that player for a 2/3. Now, when these 2 came out in relatively same time span, at least when I was taking them on my binder, there was a consideration to run both of them. And I quickly talked myself out of it, right? Because this would be Pain Train all day. If you drafted both of these, there's no way anybody could beat you. But upon coming home and seeing that Sardardian Avenger did so much damage, and I want to support the kind of the incremental damage effects, Pain Distributor, in my mind, is on a same axis, cost more, has menace instead of that first strike trample, which can be devastating. and gives the player, after you cast this, an opportunity on basically during their first spell they cast to make a treasure token to kind of march forward. What do you think about this card, May?
So I'm just gonna go ahead and outright say and correct you that these two, they are two peas in a pod, but they are in two different tiers in your environment. Where Sardine Avenger is an Oko level threat for your environment.
I would agree with that.
If you're not playing Sardine Avenger in your environment, then you're losing to Sardine Avenger. Pain Distributor comes down for 3 for starters, which means that it's a whole turn later. Even though, yes, it has Menace, it has a better floor, whatever excuse we want to give it, at the end of the day, you're giving your opponent's treasures, and you have that kind of Mayhem Devil effect strapped on, but worse. Instead of being able to ping anything, it's just ping into their face. But, like, Sardine Avenger does the same thing. Point is that even though they both do the same thing, Pain Distributor doesn't completely run over your opponent for just playing what your cube already does with First Strike Trample. It's just a 3-drop, 2/3 menace, and no matter what, you're always getting to 2/3 menace. But you are giving yourself and your opponent treasure tokens just for casting spells, but punishing your opponent for using those treasure tokens. And that is an entirely different thing from what Sardine Avenger was doing.
I would agree. I think Pain Distributor should have been, when these two were, because I kind of flipped a coin between these two before I went to CubeCon, right? And I definitely, in my opinion, yeah, I chose wrongly. I chose poorly. But I think Pain Distributor is on a much better, kind of really plays into what Red wants to do more on a much more fair manner. And you hit all the marks that I wanted to say. So whenever I came back from CubeCon, after observing this card just wrecking people, I did swap out Sardinian for the Pain Distributor. And I'm going to try it out here in about 2 weeks at another event that we're having, and I'm excited to see how it plays out. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I want to say that I appreciate Dan's theory, because that's what he had, and that he also, I think, proved his theory that Selesnya, if you solely draft it, does the thing in my environment that can't really compete with anything else. The other players just didn't have that knowledge, which there's no meta, right? That's what happened last year with this environment. There was no meta, and people learned the meta on the fly. Something like Sardinian Avenger doesn't really require a meta. It just kind of, like you said, the Oko of the environment. That's the best descriptor, right?
Yep. It's the perfect case where if you would look at this card from an outside view, not look at any other cards in your environment, and I told you that this was the Oko of this environment, all right, somebody's brows would start raising at me, all right? But this is an example of why power levels of cards can be different from environment to environment, and not just flat across the line, oh, everything's just great and everything. No, there's specific context where things are just better or worse.
And so based on Dan's observations, and when I came back, literally almost after just driving 17, 18 hours, I couldn't sleep. I'm like, whatever, I'm going to make these changes now. Because we talked about it. Team UberCube on the way home just had all these conversations. So like when I pulled up at my front doorstep and after I dropped my luggage off, I knew the changes that I was going to make, right? Like they were nothing, no mystery here. And thank you, Dan, for really pointing these things out. Another one that I actually caught, and there's a different reason for this, was Citizen's Crowbar. For 1 colorless and 1 white, get an artifact equipment. When Citizen's Crowbar enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token, then attach Citizen's Crowbar to it. Then equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has pay 1 planes, tap, sacrifice Crowbar, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Equip for 2. The reason why I cut this is not because it's not great and doesn't support the equipment deck, and I may reconsider this one. It's because it made an oddball token, which, by the way, DSB did make this token for me, so this may not be the permanent cut, but I decided I wanted to trim 1 back and decided to put in Daring Archaeologist for 3 colorless and 1 white, creature human artificer. When Daring Archaeologist enters the battlefield, you may return target artifact from your graveyard to your hand. Whenever you cast a historic spell, put a 1/1 counter on Daring Archaeologist. Artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic for a 3/3. White's identity...
You know things are dire when you have to cut Citizen's Crowbar.
Yeah, I mean, I may go back. You and I can talk about this after the show. There may be a better... Frankly, there may be a better cut. I did this one on the fly, and even as I typed this particular show up, I was thinking maybe this wasn't the choice, because it does fit into my equipment deck. But The reason why I definitely want Daring Archaeologist to go in because White's identity in the cube is kind of that reclaim situation. I don't want White.
Hmm.
I wanted to take White and Green and tone it back so they don't hate artifacts as much when there's so many opportunities for them to actually either they could synergize with artifacts and or reclaim artifacts, and I think that's a better opportunity for me as a curator. I still want the hate components, the disenchants to exist, but maybe not in that manner. Do you have any thoughts about other than Citizen Crowbar? Definitely probably not the choice. We'll review my list, but I think there's definitely the need for Daring Archaeologist. What do you think?
So this is one thing that's also related to why I'm not making instant changes to the fake cube, like right after CubeCon, is that I am waiting for the data to come in. And I think once the data comes in, you'll have more opportunities to see which cards within that problematic slot could be cut. And what's really nice about having us be some of the featured cubes this year was the fact that we just get so much data and information that we get to siphon through and determine what's best and what has been kind of problematic in our environments. So I'm not making any immediate changes to the fake cube. A lot of it is just going to be hypotheticals, and I think that a lot of your changes right now are kind of up in the air, especially when like Citizens Crowbar, where it's like it does cut away from your package, which is the goal, but it also happens to just be a uniquely playable card at a very fair rate. So,
yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know either. I don't think that's the best choice in retrospect. But for now, it's just a placeholder, right? I'm almost.
It'll be a good placeholder change.
I'm almost certain that it'll go back in for something else. I definitely didn't want to touch 1 or 2 instant speed because you need a certain amount of that for like I guess the KCI combo type stuff and things that you're building up to that needs to be challenged like an instant speed. And maybe the Crowbar kind of played into the instant speed as well, and I shouldn't have touched it, and I should go something a little bit more sorcery speed. I think I can redact that one, but for now, it's a placeholder. The next thing that on our Team UberCube ride back from CubeCon, 18 hours of talking, right? We kind of just had people, while Stu was driving on the way back, bless his soul, that's why Stu's not joining us, he's tired, has no voice, is that...
Poor guy.
Yeah, he was exhausted. Is that Black had too many reclaim effects. Like, in the original iteration of Uberbear's Artifact Cube, circa 2022, I actually ran Necromancy in the cube. And it was just it's a powerful card, but also like a super flavor fail. Like, it was a placeholder. And a while back, I actually decided to do stuff that was a little bit more artifact-centric on my return. And the card that I had added over it at the time was Emergency Weld for 1 colorless and 1 swamp. You get a sorcery, return target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand, create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token, which is a fine serviceable card. But I already have other effects, including like actual artifacts that do the thing, right? And this was like a package of 4 in the black section. And in the way back when, I had played with my little brother Josh, and we had made the determination to cut a card that I have since re-added. I wish it was in CubeCon 2023, and that was I re-added Necron Overlord for 2 colorless and 2 black artifact creature Necron Noble, Relentless March, or pay X, tap X, untapped artifact creatures you control. Target opponent loses X life for 2/5, which is a huge mid-range, shuts down that aggro type of component. What do you think about that change, May?
This is just straight up a win con for Agatha's Children. I'm just putting that out there, and I am all for it.
I didn't even think about that, but now that you're saying it out loud, yes, it is. But I think that's
It absolutely is, but like, I'm here for it.
Yeah, we're going to test it at an event that we're having about 2 or 3 weeks here, where we're getting a bunch of people together and some curators, and we're going to really determine if this actually makes an impact on the environment. I think Agatha's Soul Cauldron, I didn't actually think about that line, does add a component to it, but I think I need a little bit of that to make that card spicy. It's already really spicy. I don't think you need help with that. We're gonna do some double spice. We're gonna test mode this, right? But at the end of the day, Black's identity was getting a little lost with me trying to put too many, I guess we'll call them artifact reclaim effects. And White was doing it too, right? And so I wanted to bring that back a little bit and put a little bit more creature threat in there. And when we went through the entire Scryfall list, this is like the entire van of additional 6 people that were nodding their heads saying, yes, yes, this card needs to go back in. So Necron Overlord's going to go back in post the CubeCon change for me. Like you kind of made a good point. I'm a very snap changer, and you're very like deliberate in your changes. And that's you're a maybe board type of person. We've talked about this before. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that it's good to give your environment time to adjust and, time for yourself to really take in data and feedback and etc. And then just kind of consider those changes. That way, when you're not immediately impulsively jumping in on every little comment or thing, so that way you can give yourself time to really clear your thoughts and be like, actually, this thing's probably fine. Like, I've had a lot more cards that I wanted to mention for the Fake Cube, obviously, that a lot of those cards where it's like, it comes up because it has been mentioned as possibly being an outlier in this environment, but sometimes it's a matter of, hey, this thing's a horse. I am not telling you a third time. It's a horse. Like, with our Avenger, that one you have to answer immediately. But with some of these things where it's just like, oh, maybe you have a bit too much redundancy for black, and putting in Necron Overlord to give it a little bit more spicy directions for black. I think that's great. I think that is a good change to consider.
And another card, so I didn't actually, kind of going back to that one, I didn't receive any like active feedback about that so much as me as a curator writing with my team just kind of talked about our experience and what their thoughts were. That was the one card out of this grouping that I didn't get any feedback. I just noticed my saturation was pretty heavy, and that blacks, it all kind of shelled from back to Dan's theory, is that if I could just get creatures that weren't artifact centric to stick, I could take this game. So I decided to give black a little bit more of, all right, well, if that's what you're going to do, then I'm going to do something like Necron Overlord to really try to put you on a clock, right? Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the next card,
Talks
this one was kind of talked about, but not like because it caused any problems, because players just said it's kind of boring, and I observed them just using it at its very base idea, and it was too slow. And that was Blast Zone. It's a land. Blast Zone enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. I ran this in my Powered Vintage Cube for a little while, and it kind of had a similar effect. Tap, add 1 colorless mana. And for XX, put X charge counters on Blast Zone. Pay 3, tap, sacrifice Blast Zone, destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So it's a little different because it doesn't ever enter with 0, so it can't do that effect where it kills tokens. It really just kills, mana value 1+. But by the time you've sunk so much mana into this card, it was low impact, and I found people that did run this, it ended up just being like, all right, well, I've got a piece of mana that gives me 1 colorless, and maybe, just maybe, I'll get a 1 mana value thing, maybe. But it was pretty weak. It was pretty weak, right? And going back to...
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. To give you some context for my draft, I got this card as the last pick of my pack, and I still didn't run it in my deck.
Yeah, I just don't think it's not what I wanted it to be. Maybe it was something in a time long forgotten that maybe it had a place, but now it's too dirtily. And going back to Dan Schneider's theory, I wanted something, and I added this when I got home too, that's impactful, that threatens and attacks the creatures and makes artifacts a little scarier, right? So you can't cut them to pieces.
The thing about Blast Zone is that it's still a great card, but again, it's this context that matters in this environment where all of your scary artifacts are coming down at 3. All of your scary artifacts aren't coming down at 1 and 2. And that's when Blast Zone is scary. Blast Zone is scary when things are at 1 or 2. Because that's when I can just put in like 2 mana, put in an extra charge counter, and then pay 3 later to just blow all of your things up and get huge returns out of it. But the problem is that your environment just naturally has a higher curve, that by the time that this thing, you put so much mana into Blast Zone in order to get that return, that you aren't able to spend that mana in places where you needed to in order to win the game. So it's not impactful enough. And in an environment where you have like scary things like, somewhere you'd have a Soul Ring, Blast Zone is going to be great in that environment, but in this one, it's just not that good.
I would agree with that totally.
So
it's kind of like, by theory, it's a mana sink, but it's not a great mana sink, and you just don't have time for it. So I swapped it out when I got home after the long ride with Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. For 5 colors, get a legendary artifact vehicle. Flying. When Sky Sovereign console flagship enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, which is kind of flavor text as far as my environment is concerned, because I don't run planeswalkers, and partially the reason why I never added it before, if I'm being honest, and it attacks an opponent controls. Crew 3 for a 6/5. Going back to Dan's theory about how he was able to stick Manglehorn, I thought that I wanted something on the artifact spectrum that when it ETB'd, I could kill a Manglehorn if I'm using that as my target, right? Something that I could get repetitious value out of. Or Sky Sovereign, enter the battlefield tapped, it still basically bolts the Manglehorn for 3 versus its 2/2 power and toughness, right? So I saw this as a safe, not necessarily a murder effect, but something that could get out there and take care of the problem at those low values and represented like a real threat that people would be excited to like even welder into this, right? And do the thing. So go ahead.
I'm going to challenge you a little bit.
Go ahead.
What is the percentage of 3 toughness or less creatures in your environment?
It's definitely on the lower scale. I'm looking at it. Most of the deadly threats to artifacts are around 3, like Rex Sages and whatnot. If I'm using that as my poster child. So that people can't get repetition.
So if you're putting in this card specifically to hurt the anti-deck, then what deck is this? What deck is Sky Sovereign helping? Because I love this card. I think it's interesting. I think it could be a really good include. But I think that that's something that you could think about maybe after the podcast is just, what is this thing actually hitting outside of that package?
It may not, but at the end of the day, it's a 6/5 flyer and I love vehicles that you can hide behind them. And I wanted to increase my vehicle percentages because they're a little lower. I'm running stuff like Bankbuster and whatnot, right? And Looter Scooter, etc. Sure. And I wanted some inspiration to kind of use the pilot tokens that are being generated by Bankbuster. Something a little spicy to put in here as a really strong top end for that package to make vehicles wake up a little bit. I didn't want to put too many vehicles in here, because I have like some borderline 4 mana value Day of Judgment type effects. So I didn't want people to hide behind explosions and then drop a creature and attack. I run that in Commander, but I didn't want that to kind of translate to my environment. And I thought this was just good enough of a threat that if I put a welder out or something like that, that I could chase into this and then start crewing this for 3 and start hitting people with a 6/5 flyer that doesn't have like that vulnerability to wraths all the time. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I love this card. I'm really glad you included it.
Yeah, it probably should have been there the whole time. I want to go ahead and thank Dan Schneider for kind of really pointing out that theory and crafting it and making it execute. And then I did notice that the other players at the particular table that I got slotted into didn't understand. I'm going to redact that. Didn't see those lines that Dan did because he scooped up all the Selesnya package and he had the lion's share of the hatred towards artifacts and that strategy of playing with creatures that are impervious to artifact hate while going and taking out these major threats was really just brilliant. But also at the same time, as a curator, I don't want to nerf that because I love that type of build. But at the same time, I needed to tone it back just a smidge. And what I did like about CubeCon 2023 versus 2022 is I'm not running the Kataki's War Wages. I'm not running the oafs anymore, right? So my hate levels had come down substantially. And it was really nice to see people just grab onto these components that just was able to mitigate the risk of artifacts just enough to make it fun still. And Dan would have actually closed out the entire pod, but he got a bad draw. We did talk about that too. If he had hit just a bad draw, a little bit too many lands, he would have taken this entire grouping. May, you had something you want to say about the Fake Cube?
A few more cards that I wanted to mention for the Fake Cube and just miscellaneous changes that I wanted to maybe consider that, but I should at least talk about them and acknowledge them. So the first one was Boomerang, because as you mentioned before, just boomeranging a tap land can be the equivalent of Time Walk in a lot of cases. And I think that it does serve a good purpose for blue to really slow down some of the more aggressive packages, and I think that that is a good thing to have in this environment, but whether or not that's going to be excluded because it does bounce lands is, because if you're only bouncing a regular land, it's not going to feel as impactful as just hitting a tap land, you know?
Yeah, I can see that.
But What are your thoughts on Boomerang?
I think I would run something a little bit more splashable. It only hits non-land permanents. There's a lot of the ones that there's two of them in particular that let you draw a card if you pay the kicker costs. The kicker cost ones in particular.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's the
into the Royal. Yeah, the draw card ability on that's really nice, and people are willing to pay that, and it offers a little bit of modality. Boomerang's a great card, and it fits the speed of the environment. But I did abuse it. I still lost, if that makes you feel better. I mean, I was playing against Justin Parnell, but I tried.
It's just whether or not that's going to be a feel bad.
Yeah, no, it wasn't.
But that art.
The art is gorgeous, but I do see your point.
Beautiful Rebecca Gay piece.
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for the feel bads if somebody did it like I did it. I was very intentional though. I had a mission, right? And I don't think it's cuttable. I just think that I abused it a little bit. I may have taken advantage of the cards. Sure. The card's generosity was there, and I took it.
Another card that I wanted to mention that I am considering swapping it out, but I haven't found a good spot. I haven't found the perfect swap, but I might have an idea for that. And it got mentioned that Crippling Fear, which is 2 black for a sorcery, choose a creature type. Creatures that aren't of the chosen type get -3/-3 until end of turn. First and foremost, it's about 80% of the environment that has 3 toughness or less. It is a large portion of the environment that has 3 toughness or less. I included this as a way to kind of punish the party decks and the decks that don't have a specific direction, because party decks can't run this card. And its potential to swing games into your favor is very good and very high. However, whether or not having a basically damnation in my cube is going to be worth it is kind of questionable. I was thinking Extinction, much worse flavor. I'm just going to put that out there for the moment, is that Extinction is a 4 and a black sorcery. Destroy all creatures of any creature type of your choice. Where it's the inverse effect, where it comes out for 1 mana later, but this one actually hits changelings, versus the other one doesn't.
Oh, I can see the difference.
What are
Actually,
your thoughts?
This card was mentioned to me as well, too. It was basically said, why is this card in here? When I sat at a table, that was brought to my attention. And as I'm doing the butterfly going around the room talking to people, that card came up to me a couple times. I think enough players felt like the feel-bads did happen a little bit with that. Yes. I mean, what you said out loud did occur.
Yeah. Which is unfortunate. Like, I don't think Extinction's the perfect flavor, but it might be a good slot in. I'll just keep looking at a miscellaneous board wipes for black and try to figure out something else that can go there, just that way we can kind of hurt some of these packages a little bit.
Oh, absolutely.
But I am very glad that the adventure deck didn't seem to be problematic. Like, initially it came up as a concern that if the party deck comes, or if the adventure deck comes together, then it can just outvalue and mid-range its way through the game in a way that was very, very overwhelming for a lot of decks. So I was initially concerned about it. However, I think that with the speed of like Rakdos Goblins, Orzhov Party, and the Warrior deck, all 3 of those are just really strong packages that the adventure deck can't really outvalue. So whether or not I need to address how many adventures that I have in here and maybe cut a few, that is a consideration. Did you have any adventures that you thought were particularly either boring or problematic?
No, I did not. The adventures they went around the table, I think, got spliced up pretty well. Like, people enjoy adventures and they work well in decks, and they got so distributed so nicely that no one got the lion's share of it. I think you're going to get those one-offs where maybe someone inadvertently passes all of them, kind of like the Dan Schneider situation where everybody's getting all the individual hate pieces of artifact components to destroy them. I could see that happening where the adventures get passed that way, but that didn't happen in my pod when I sat down. They were evenly distributed, and I did in fact run a few of them, but they were just evenly dispersed. So you can't really predict that as a curator either, right? Like, in a culmination, it could be a real problem that you got adventure.deck or artifact hate.deck, but that's only because there's no meta developed. And because we sat at this unique situation, that the opportunity for that to happen is more available than if you sit with your regular play group and you play. Like, my play group knows that the artifact hate is real. That is why in 2022, these cards dominated because, and they talked about that during when they're doing the featured match. Andy Mangold and Justin Parnell were talking about the Selesnya package. My group would never pass all that to one person because they've developed a meta around my cube environment. Whereas there was no meta at CubeCon 2022, and someone probably thought these cards were borderline bad, except for the pros that saw these lines were so strong and studied the list, right? So they walked in kind of a gamer's advantage, if you will. And that can happen, but I don't think you can make a snap judgment. I would say that your adventure package is in a very healthy place. And I actually, I drafted your otter, by the way. And I kept making otter jokes.
I love the otter.
I made why otter dad jokes the whole time. People wanted to kill me, but I had so much fun. Oh, it was so great. The otter's like the best card. Like I was so hyped to grab that card.
Oh, definitely. It's my favorite.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely gorgeous piece of art. And
second favorite. Hypnotic Sprite's my favorite.
And it was a wizard. So I was going to try to Riptide Laboratory it. I had a whole plan that never happened. But
unfortunate.
Here we are. The next one is, we're going to talk about my other featured cube, was Uberbear's Horror Cube. And I want to start out by apologizing to the judges because I heard there was an incident with old werewolves versus new werewolves. As a matter of fact, I was talking to Austin Bones and Judge Rob about the situation that happened there, and they got it sorted out, but it was about the language between the two. I only run 3 old werewolves of the original printing, and then the rest of them run the day-night. And I decided because of the power, because of the impact of the first 3. So in the werewolf package, some of the old ones that I did keep was stuff like Mare of Avonbrook. For 1 colorless and 1 green, you get a creature, human advisor werewolf. Other human creatures you control get +1/+1. At the beginning of your upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform Mare of Avonbrook, and it flips over to Howlpack Alpha, creature werewolf. Other werewolf and wolves creatures you control get +1/+1. At the beginning of your end step, put a 2/2 green wolf creature token onto the battlefield. At the beginning of your upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, transform Howlpack Alpha for a 3/3. That's the old printing versus the new one uses the Daybound, Nightbound, which that mechanic reads like this. Daybound, if a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night next turn. And then Nightbound, if a player casts at least 2 spells during their own turn, it becomes day the next turn. So, other than Immerwolf, which is an interesting card that stops that from happening, the flippity-flop of something like Avonbrook could get really weird. And I know they had a judge call that they had to do some serious mathing on. And that was kind of funny to hear. They're like, yeah, you caused an incident. And I'm like, well, here we are. I mean, it happens. But you know what? They're here to stay, right? The last 3 remnants of the original package, they haven't caused a problem in our group. We don't typically do that. But I can see where people did embrace the werewolf package and play it to its fullest. And that if you had to demonstrate those 2 different ideas and the way they read, it could cause a lot of problems. But the judges solved it, so kudos to them. The only change that I made to Uberbear's Horror Cube when I got home, and this one's another one of me doing the social butterfly, moving around the room, asking people about their thoughts on the cube. People generally gave me, I got 99% positive feedback because people love Innistrad type environments, right? Nothing felt like a strange outlier, except for this card, Ancient Tomb. It was a land, tap, add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Ancient Tomb deals 2 damage to you. And you're asking yourself, why is that? Because it gave such a unique, fast-paced Soul Ring type of effect, is what players told me, that they were able to jump into their turns a little sooner.
It's fast mana.
It's fast mana. It's very punishing. Like my group as a whole, and we talked about this on the way home, sees no problem with this card. But the players that had never played it felt like this was just too quick. And so how do I get that type of, I want to keep the mana density heavy, and I studied for a while my environments to try to figure out what I was going to do. I decided that Ancient Tomb wasn't really necessary. It's thematic. It's beautiful. I've got the old Tempest art with the spirits coming out of the tomb. It's absolutely gorgeous. But I decided I'm just going to let it go. I can use it somewhere else. And I put in Worn Power Stone. For 3 colorless, you get an artifact. Worn Power Stone enters the battlefield tapped. So that's a key component. Tap, add 2 colorless mana to your pool. And I've got the nice looking foil version of that added to my environment. It's on the same axis. it kind of plays into Ancient Tomb versus Warren Powerstone on that incremental decision. Plays similar axis to Sardadian Avenger versus Pain Distributor. Like, one's definitely
Right.
the better of the two. And so I stepped it down.
However, I will ask, what deck needs Warren Powerstone?
Nothing really. The werewolves could make use of it. I increase my mana saturation and I don't run any soul rings. So it's a fair challenge point.
Sure.
But it's on theme, it's pretty, and you can definitely use it to get into your larger werewolves and your Uvenwall oddities, things like that, right? And I do run planeswalkers in this environment. I run like Liliana's, I run a couple of the Arlen Chords, etc., that would want to have two colorless to fill in those blank slots. I do have ramp, but if the ramp gets overly distributed across the board, I could see it being problematic.
Sure.
What do you think?
I just ask because I think that this is an interesting inclusion over Ancient Tomb because you're trying to do like a side upgrade into a similar degree like what you did with the Avenger. But my real concern is that what niche is this actually helping outside of that Ancient Tomb had fantastic flavor? Is mid-range going to want ramp? I don't think it does.
It to be determined. To be determined.
Sure.
I don't know. I'm just here for it. I don't know.
I think you should digest that change a little bit because I think that slot could be used for a lot of other interesting things in your packages that might need a little bit of other support.
Yeah.
Like, why don't we talk about the vampire lifelink situation?
Well, that was the reason why Ancient Tomb got cut, is because having played Ancient Tomb's very punishing, and I run stuff like Sulfuric Vortex, etc. in the environment. Like, the punishment's real.
Right.
Like, the life totals get pretty low, and the only deck that does recover and recoup is the Vampire Lifelink situation. And that's also the only deck that really wanted Ancient Tomb. I mean, not truly, but like really, really wants Ancient Tomb because it's not worried about it'll get the life back that it pays. The other ones are definitely, this is a very clock-based, creature-centric environment. Very Vorthos, right? And Ancient Tomb did create this fast pace where people would tap it, mostly to get into their talisman, is what I was told. Which is also punishing, right? But they didn't mind doing it because they'd fast forward, now they have access to color. And so they have 3 for 3 at that point, one color plus 2 colorless. So people were doing it in the vampire deck to fast forward. Warren Powerstone is a very safe pick for me, and I just so happen to have an extra one because I cut it powered vintage environment.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, shall we move down to Jace and Self-Mill?
Yeah, so this one's more of a kudos to a player. This was going to Mike, a.k.a. Limpless7, Discord name, actually built that I got to observe while walking around doing my social butterfly stuff, because that was my favorite part about CubeCon, is walking around just asking people questions and getting to know people, right? That's what I was actually doing. I wasn't there to win it. I was just, a matter of fact, my rank is like awful. Do not look at my rank for CubeCon. It is horrible. Like, I'm up in the top 400s, but I enjoyed myself with the social networking aspect of it. And he designed an entire deck based around Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. For 1 colorless and 3 blue, you get a legendary Planeswalker Jace. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game. So very Laboratory Maniac focused type of deck.
We love lab band decks.
+1, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into the graveyard, then draws a card. -8, draw 7 cards. Then if your library has no cards in it, you win the game for a foil loyalty Planeswalker. What Mike did is something that redefined my vision of the Self-Mill. Self-Mill, up to this point, aside from the werewolves, in my mind as a curator, has always been the hardest, most unachievable deck, right? The one that's the people try so hard to do but can never quite pull off. Mike redefined that for me. He actually was one of the top 8 winners of all CubeCon, right? Didn't obviously make top 1, but man, crushed the game. Really, this individual knew what they were doing with Cube. And what they did is build an entire control shell out of Grixis that did nothing, virtually creatureless. I mean, almost, with aside from like a Snapcaster Mage type thing here and there, and maybe the Arcanus, all they really did, and Wandering Mind was another card that went in there, run nothing but counter
There's
magic.
also the Hermit that's used for countering.
Yep. Well, they ran. This is they may have ran Hermit. This is actually their pile, not their list that I'll have because I need to get the final list. But they ran a really amazing mana suite and nothing but counter draw type of effects and hand stripping, and just took the entire pod with a deck that I thought I've traditionally played this with like a self mill, like forcing the situations. That makes sense, like forcing the draw, forcing the mill, milling myself, kind of Hogak type as a back out, maybe some reanimator. No, Mike didn't do any of that. Mike just did Grixis. You will have nothing stick. And it was a reinvention of this entire deck. It's always been there. I just never saw it. If you can do stuff like Inquisition of Kozilek and stuff like that, and keep them on their toes so they're never sticking, cryptic commands. I mean, it was Mystic Confluences, Mana Leaks. As a matter of fact, he told me a funny story. In his first matchup...
All right, go for it.
Yeah, in his first matchup, he force spiked someone. Like turn one, he was on the play.
Hilarious.
Next player plays, force spikes. The player announces to the table that Mike has a force spike. Mike's very happy. Mike's very happy about this because as he explained it, for the rest of the matches that he went into, he now has a Thalia on deck, as far as he's concerned, because everyone played around. He said players played around force spike for every matchup at that point because one player announced he has force spike in his deck. Fantastic. Thank you, Mike, for like pushing the envelope on what I could see as a curator, because I thought this was the weakest deck. And after looking at this deck list, which I'll share in the show notes, it is gorgeous. And I watched it run, and it ran like a machine. All he did was delve and make sure that Jace came out late in the game. And if Jace came out too early, he made sure that Jace got pushed down in the deck so that he could keep it hidden from the opponent and then bring it out towards the end and close games. It was the crescendo of my experience. Do you have any thoughts on this one, Mike?
It's definitely a really cool deck.
Oh my gosh.
I think my favorite part about it is the innate, what's the word for it? Divergence?
Oh yeah. Just did something like, I didn't see a creatureless deck existing in here, not for this idea. I always thought you need to defend the Jace. Nah, he just made sure that Jace was highly protected through removal spells, counter magic, and hand stripping suite. It was a masterpiece. Absolutely masterclass deck. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate what you did there because you taught me something about my own cube that it's got me kind of excited to try this out, and it probably won't stick. But, May, do you have any final thoughts before we move into our summary here? Your experiences at CubeCon.
Yeah, I just want to take a second to thank everybody who came up to us, talk about their experience, sent us their decks, etc. And we're always excited to hear more through our socials. So always feel free to reach out to us. And thank you all so much for playing and giving us feedback for all these cubes.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody that let me interrupt their games to ask questions about my cubes. That's what really epitomizes CubeCon for me, right? They're all in a serious competition. They're all wanting to go top 64, top 8, and win CubeCon so they can get that honor and victory. But at the same time, every individual I spoke to is like, sure, let me show you what I got in my hand. What do you think about this? Or as they're drafting, like, is this card any good or not? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It made for an interesting dynamic because I just wanted to see players that have bigger brains than my group or outside of my meta draft my environments and then give me active feedback. And as a curator, May and I've talked about this a lot. I'm a little bit more spontaneous. She's a lot more maybe bored. But what we get from this is I got live feedback that was actionable feedback that I could actually take on my 17 plus hour ride home and talk about with my group about the things I learned because I took notes, and we found replacements that I felt like were pretty good. Some of them questionable, but we can work through that.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, we want to move over to our summary. I want to go ahead and say special thanks to everyone who joined CubeCon, everybody that supported Team UberCube, right? And drafted all of our cubes, Sandwich's Peasant Cube, both of my Horror Cube and my Artifact Cube, and May's Fey Cube, which is amazing. And really give us feedback. That's worth its weight in gold to a curator to get that kind of knowledge. And we're looking forward to that data being provided by the CubeCon team, which leads me to that. Thank you to the CubeCon team. John, Cultic Cube, Zach, Justin Parnell, Corey, John Brostoff.
This event would not have been possible without all of you, and we want to thank you all very much because you all did a fantastic job this year.
Absolutely. It's just bringing in the amazing guests that were all about Cube. Everything about it felt intimate. Everything felt warm. If you didn't go, I understand for different reasons, but I highly recommend everybody start saving. There is time. You have 300 and something, 50 something days by the time this podcast comes out to go ahead and start crunching those numbers. But I feel like if you're looking for a con to go to, this is the best con this is the one. If you want to experience Magic from a whole different level where you can interrupt games and ask questions and people are okay with that, right? That's a vibe. And play until you're delirious. That's a vibe. And then have, amazing time, drink you some Spreckers. It's just the way to go, right? Shout out to J-Bro there. Thank you to the judges for putting up with my werewolf nonsense. And yes, and special thank you to Gwen Decker for putting together.
Congratulations, you were the incident.
I was the incident, and thank you, Gwen, for putting together not only Cube Cobra, which is the premier site to go to, but also putting together the Hedron Network, which made this so seamless, so clean. We knew where we were going as players. There was no loss. We knew our match win rates, and I could tell you without any confidence lost whatsoever that I am in the way high 400 ranking. So thank you, Gwen. And we want your feedback. So May and I and Chris and everybody that submitted from Team UberCube, we want your feedback on our cube environments, right? Hit us up in our Discord, etc. Send us those images of what you developed. We want to see that deck tech because we want to know what you felt was right, what was wrong, what you think you could be better. All that constructive criticism goes a long way to make sure that when we go back to 2024 and we submit these again, that you get the best play experience imaginable. Other than that, May, do you have any final thoughts on this stuff?
Nope.
All right.
Let's move us over to the socials.
Let's move over to the socials. So let's start out with Anthony Adams, a.k.a. Uberbear, is an associate admin, I don't know what to call myself, of the MTG Cube Drafting Facebook page. So if you're not into the Twitters or X's, we'll forever call it Twitter, or any of the Discords, and that's not your vibe, the MTG Cube Drafting Facebook page is wonderful where we can learn pack one, pick ones, curation techniques, podcasting links, resources, etc. It's just a really friendly page that I work really hard with the other administrator to ensure and moderators to ensure that it's just a pleasant environment. Also, if you love the show, we would truly appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite player. This goes a long way to actually spread the word of Cube, right? So the more people that see the podcast also see the other podcast. And there's a lot of great ones out there. There's Lucky Paper Radio. There's Cube and Chaos. There's Powerful Nothing, and so on and so forth, right? And these are all amazing podcasts, and they come up on the selections on your players, and they help spread the word of Cube. Another thing that you can do to really help out the show is order from Alter Sleeves, where we can get a 5% off of your purchase using our code. And you can bling out your cubes, those sweet alters, to slide over. I mean, I've got foils in all my cubes, and May has foil in her cubes. But when you put an alter sleeve over, it's a game changer, like a conversation piece during the draft. So we'll have that included in the Buzzsprout link and all the major players. You can click on it and follow the path, and it'll show my favorites. But if you use that group, you'll be able to get 5% off your purchase. Absolutely love alter sleeves. If you want to support the show, please use our Inked Gaming affiliate link where you can get your playmats, your dice bags, mouse pads, custom long table nonsense, whatever you want, right? They got a huge swath of products available. As a matter of fact, at CubeCon 2023, I talked about this in a previous episode, myself and May, Christian, Stu, and Chris, we all rocked our UberCube playmats, and we've got a wonderful picture where the entire table is covered in UberCube. It's fantastic. You can also find us at Twitter, at UberCubeMTGPod. I'm highly active, so is May and Stu on this environment, aka X. You can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com. You can link us on Discord. Our Discord is popping, isn't it, May?
It is. We have so many people joining and talking in here. It's been great. And you get a chance to show off your decks that you've drafted.
Oh, yeah. Stu set up a deck boast channel that everybody just kind of posts like, hey, this is what I did during CubeCon 2023 or with my friend circle or my meta or whatever. Post that on there. We want to see it. Want to hear you just show us your best and even your worst decks. We want to know what your deck tech is. It's pretty awesome. You can also support us on patreon.com/UberCube, which will be included also in the links for all the major players, etc. But I want to give a special shout out to Nicholas Lapointe, our most recent supporter, along with Stevens Conifal, Preston, and Samuel McKenna, who's also a part of our friend group, or that plays with us every Thursday now. So thanks, Sam. But we really appreciate our Patreons. May, do you have any thoughts about the Patreons? You always have a cool little tune, a jingle.
Tell us, tell us, tell us, tell us. Tell us, tell us, tell us, tell us. Tell us more from the Patreon.
That's my favorite part. Other than that, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to say, Happy
Cubing.
Cubing.